Welcome, everybody, to the 90th meeting of the National Housing Conference. NHC was founded by Mary Kingsbury Simkovich during the worst economic crisis in American history. This past year, we have experienced the worst pandemic and economic crisis of our lifetime. Together, we've worked to help our fellow Americans weather this storm and stay in their homes. There remains a lot to do. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce the chair of our Board of Governors, Anne McCulloch, CEO of the Housing Partnership Equity Trust. Some of you may not have had the opportunity to meet Anne yet. For those of us on the staff and the board, and many others involved in affordable housing, she is a trusted friend and colleague, an experienced leader, and effective provider of affordable housing. Anne previously served as Senior Vice President of Credit and Housing Access of Fannie Mae. Before Fannie Mae, she held many leadership positions in government at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Resolution Trust Corporation. And she was a lawyer in private practice representing advocacy groups, labor unions, and nonprofits on mission and organizational matters. Anne, thank you so much for everything you do for NHC.
David, thank you. And welcome all of y'all to the annual meeting of National Housing Conference. I can't believe it's year 2 of having virtual meetings and not getting a chance to get together. But I'm happy to have this chance to talk with all of you. And I really do want to thank you for joining us, remote though it is. This year has certainly seen a lot of amazing challenges and a lot of opportunities for the conference, where we've been able to work together to have an impact on the crisis that has been housing and healthcare this year. And it's really a relief to see that we're beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel after such a devastating national trauma. NHC members this year have provided a wide range of thoughtful leadership throughout the country, helping communities all across the country solve the challenges we faced. So I want to take a moment to introduce you to our executive committee and thank them for the guidance and the counsel that they continue to provide to National Housing Conference. They've contributed a lot to NHC's success and to their own institution's leadership in housing over the past year. So our vice chair is Steve O'Connor from the Mortgage Bankers Association. Our secretary is Ralph Perry, the executive director of the Tennessee Housing Development Agency. Our treasurer is Angie Lathrop from Bank of America, Dwayne Duncan from Genworth, Chris Tomey from the Terwilliger Center for Housing at the Urban Land Institute, and Connie Wright from Wells Fargo round out our executive committee. We're very fortunate to have a very engaged board and executive committee, and we're particularly grateful for the significant time that our executive committee has contributed to our success. Now I'll turn it back to David to introduce our honored guest, House Financial Services Chairwoman Maxine Waters.
Thank you, Anne. And we're just waiting to get the link right with the chairwoman. And she'll be on just a moment.
Mr.
Thank you. I am going to introduce you now, which is overdue, but I'm thrilled to have you with us. We are honored to have with us today Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and she is one of the most influential leaders in housing and finance today. And if you don't know that, you definitely don't read the newspaper. She has earned a reputation as a fearless and outspoken advocate for women, children, people of color, and the poor. You always know where she stands, but what many don't see on the news is how effectively she has partnered with her colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Elected in November 2020 to her 16th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congresswoman Waters represents the 43rd Congressional District of California, which includes a large part of South Los Angeles, including the communities of Westchester, Playa del Rey, and Watts, as well as the cities of Inglewood, Lawndale, Lomita, and Torrance, among others. Congresswoman Waters made history as the first woman and first African-American chair of the House Financial Services Committee. She is also an integral part of the congressional Democratic leadership. Throughout her more than 40 years of public service, Chairwoman Waters has combined her strong legislative and public policy acumen and high visibility in Democratic Party activities with an unusual ability to do grassroots organizing. She has used her skills to shape public policy and deliver the goods for her constituents, the nation, and the world as a whole, including over $45 billion in rental assistance and $10 billion in homeowner assistance for people economically impacted by the pandemic. She's also expanded U.S. debt relief for Africa and other developing nations and has been a leader in many foreign policy issues. She is author of the Down Payment Assistance Act as well, which would provide $10 billion in much needed assistance to help close the homeownership gap for people of color and others who've been left out of the American dream of homeownership. But rather than have me go on, I would prefer to listen to her tell us what she is doing now to help millions of our fellow Americans recover from this devastating pandemic and its deep economic impact, while moving forward on historic initiatives in housing and community development. Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're absolutely welcome, and thank you for your patience. I've thought many times about doing these Zooms alone from my home, but what I experienced this morning with the technical difficulty, I'll never do it without staff assistance. So thank you very much. So I'd like to thank you, NHC President and CEO David Dworkin, for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me with you today. Congratulations to the National Housing Conference for celebrating its 90th anniversary. I'm so pleased to join you all for this momentous occasion, especially during National Home Ownership Month. I want to begin by thanking the members of the National Housing Conference for the role you all have played during the pandemic to basically fight to ensure families remain safely and stably housed. We need all hands on deck to pass the CARES Act. We needed that, and we got that from you. When this pandemic began, I sounded the alarm on the need for emergency rental assistance. I introduced legislation to provide an eviction moratorium for renters, forbearance for relief, and a moratorium on foreclosures for homeowners, and assistance for people experiencing homelessness. With the CARES Act relief, we have secure housing and shelter that allowed people to remain safe during peak months of COVID-19 infections. Months later, we needed all hands on deck to pass the December relief package, and we did. We secured $25 billion in the first round for emergency rental assistance. And I want to thank you, David, and NHC for your help in making the case for this relief. After President Biden was elected, we saw the need for additional stimulus. Once again, we needed all hands on deck to pass the American Rescue Plan, and we did. We secured $21.6 billion in additional emergency rental assistance and $10 billion in assistance to homeowners struggling to make mortgage, utility, and other housing payments. NHC and members of the Black Homeownership Collaborative were critical to the effort to gain support for these critical resources. As millions remained unemployed, behind on housing payments, and as our nation works to get everyone fully vaccinated, we will continue to need all hands on deck to ensure that pandemic relief reaches every family that needs, and our recovery is felt equitably across every community in this country. I'm now focused on making sure that these investments are administered equitably and reach those most in need, including low-income people, people of color, who remain disproportionately at risk of evictions, foreclosures, and homelessness in the coming months. The battle to stabilize families and our economy is not over, and I need you all to keep showing up again and again. Part of our next mission should be very familiar to you. We must expand access to home ownership for Black and Brown first-generation home buyers. Last week, I spent the day in Tulsa, Oklahoma. honoring the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. The Greenwood District was a thriving and prosperous Black community, in part due to the land and resources afforded to Black Native American freedmen who helped build Black Wall Street. The Greenwood community was decimated by white mobs, racism, and hate. I spent the day listening to the painful stories of survivors who witnessed the mob murder their relatives and loved ones. Part of fully honoring the loss, the pain, and the history of the Tulsa Massacre and other events like it is to invest in Black homeownership. I'm deeply concerned, as I know NHC is, that Black home ownership has fallen to its lowest levels in more than half a century. In fact, it currently stands below where it did when the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. If left unaddressed, Black homeownership rates is expected to fall even further by 2040. In this low interest rate environment, we need to ensure more Black families have equal opportunity to build wealth. This is why the Black Home Ownership Collaborative is so vitally important. I'm grateful for NHC's leadership in convening the Black Home Ownership Collaborative Steering Committee to help address this problem. I'm also pleased to be working with your steering committee, including my friends at the NAACP, the National Urban League, the National Fair Housing Alliance, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of REALTORS, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, and many others who are lending their critical expertise. As chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, I've been laser focused on addressing our nation's growing racial wealth and homeownership gaps. My bill, the Down Payment Toward Equity Act, will build on COVID relief we have already passed. It targets up to $25,000 in down payment assistance grants to first-generation home buyers who, unlike their peers, do not have access to generational or family wealth. This bill will be a major step in delivering on the promise of racial and economic justice for millions of first-generation home buyers who are disproportionately Black and brown. My Housing is Infrastructure Act of 2021 also includes $10 billion to increase access for millions of first-generation home buyers. I'm so pleased to have the Black Home Ownership Collaborative as a partner in getting this across the finish line. So last Congress, as part of the Moving Forward Act, the House passed My Housing is Infrastructure Act, which included $100 billion to boost green, safe, affordable, and accessible housing supply in every community across the country. In the wake of the current pandemic, I'm working closely with the Biden administration and my Senate counterpart, Chairman Sherrod Brown, to significantly increase the amount of housing funds, including in the upcoming infrastructure package. To optimize the impact of our investment, we must also address local zoning requirements that exacerbate racial inequity and prevent the creation of affordable multifamily developments that can address supply and affordability constraints. Finally, if the Tulsa Massacre has taught us anything, it is that the Constitution and federal laws, like the Fair Housing Act, do not enforce themselves. They are realized only insofar as our government enforces them. That is why My Housing is Infrastructure bill includes critical fair housing provisions to ensure developments are affirmatively furthering fair housing and funding to strengthen fair housing enforcement. So we have a lot of work before us, but that's why I'm optimistic at this moment. When I first introduced a Housing is Infrastructure bill in 2019, the Trump administration saw infrastructure investments as yet another way to enrich their rich cronies. No one took Trump seriously on the issue of infrastructure. Infrastructure Week was a joke on every late night talk show. But today, so many of you like me have said for decades that infrastructure is not just about roads, bridges, train tracks, water systems. All of that's important. But we believe that housing must be an essential and robust part of any national investment in infrastructure. Fortunately, we don't need to convince President Biden of that. His American Jobs Plan includes significant investments in housing. That's because, as my good friend, HUD Secretary Marshall Fudge put it so well, housing is infrastructure. Without housing, we will be building roads to nowhere. I fully support many of the proposals in the American Jobs Plan. That is why my discussion draft of the Housing is Infrastructure Act reflects several of the game-changing investments it proposes to make in the nation's affordable housing supply the plan recommends. But we need to do more, much more on housing than what the American Jobs Plan proposes. And so on this, I'm shoulder to shoulder with Senate Bacon Committee Chairman Brown. First, we must bring our nation's greatest single investment in affordable rental housing, public housing, up to the quality that the families, seniors, and people with disabilities who live in it deserve. Second, the infrastructure package Congress sends to the president must make a generational investment in deep rental assistance, along with the capital subsidies in the American Jobs Plan. That means housing choice vouchers and project-based rental assistance contracts. This is essential because, as you all know, the financing equation around operating and maintaining decent, safe, and sanitary housing for the poorest households is indisputable. It reflects the merciless math of the household budgets of these vulnerable individuals and families. That is why I fought to include $5 billion in emergency vouchers targeted to 70,000 people experiencing or at risk of homelessness in the American Rescue Plan. And that is why I'm now working with Chairman Brown to include rental assistance in the infrastructure package. I know it won't be easy. There are policy and funding challenges that the reconciliation process poses. To get beyond these challenges, Chairman Brown and I need your help. We need you to not only be advocates, but activists for this cause, because we must ensure that President Biden signs into law a package large enough to do what it needs to do. Let me conclude by emphasizing that we must all keep our eyes on the real prize. Our committee is holding a hearing on a transformative proposal to make housing an entitlement known by many as universal vouchers. The pandemic made all too clear the need to make this a reality before the next recession. It is my understanding that 90 years ago, your founder looked around her home city of Boston and saw that Black and immigrant neighborhoods were suffering the most from housing inaccessibility and insecurity. She waged a battle for safe, affordable, and dignified housing. It's not so different from what I saw decades ago on the other side of the country in my city, Los Angeles. From the East Coast to the West Coast, the pandemic has exacerbated the number of people at risk of homelessness and has added to the growing number of people living in their cars, on benches, in tents, under highways, and on the streets. Meanwhile, homeowners of color disproportionately stand to lose yet another generation of wealth to potential foreclosures. In the most prosperous nation in the world, this is inexcusable. I look forward to working with the National Housing Conference to achieve all of these critical measures. And when I talk about activism, in addition to all of the hard work you do, working with the staffs, with all of the members of Congress, working with the administration, we're going to have to hit the streets. We're going to have to organize rallies throughout the country. We're going to have to make sure that all of the housing nonprofits know and understand that it is important to get the message to those who would benefit from the work that we do. I want the homeless people under the highways and on the sidewalks and these makeshift homes that they put together with cardboard to know that we are fighting for them. It is time to end homelessness forever. I believe it is possible. I'm dedicated to the proposition that we can make it happen. So let's do everything that we can, everything that we know how to do as we plan and work with public policy, but let's add to it something that maybe many of us haven't done for a long time, and that is the kind of activism that's on the block, in the neighborhood, on the streets, gathering and rallying and making our voices heard in every corner to deal with this housing crisis that we find ourselves in. So thank you so very much for your time, for your attention, for inviting me here today. I appreciate you so very much. I love working with you, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to be able to accomplish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Waters. And I will say that on these important issues, there is no light between us. And we will be in Cleveland next week with Secretary Fudge with major announcements on closing the Black homeownership gap, which is just a travesty. We have a couple of questions for you if you have time.
Yes, yes.
First, your committee has passed a lot of important housing legislation this year, but the prospect for Senate action remains uncertain at best. What are your highest priorities for Senate action?
Well, first of all, you have identified a nagging and concerning problem that we have. And we would expect that in this administration, even though we have, Biden and Harris and such good, committed people, many who have worked on some of these issues before, and we have slight majorities in the House and in the Senate. We have witnessed that there are some who may not see things quite our way, and that they are, causing our work to be even more difficult. But I am convinced that if we are to pass housing is infrastructure and do what we want to do for homelessness and home ownership, that we must deal with not only the issues that confront us in the Senate, but we've got to make it known through concerted action to our senators who may be thinking about doing things differently and maybe thinking that things that we're talking about are not quite needed. We've got to talk with them. We've got to call them. We've got to work with them. We've got to convince them that this is our moment in history, and we've got to take advantage of it to change the direction of this country and the way things are going. So I think that our caucus is committed to the proposition that we can't let up, that we've got to do everything that we can to ensure that our members, all of them who are Democrats in the Senate, are with us in this effort.
Thank you. I'm a big believer that we need to preach to the congregation and not just the choir. The national conversation on racial equity seems to have undergone a historic shift. You took office in 1991, the year of the Rodney King beating and subsequent unrest. I think it's fair to say that before this year, little had changed. In this past year, is it different? And what do you think we can accomplish in housing and more broadly?
Well, let me just say I'm the eternal optimist. Even when I retire in the evening to bed, feeling disgusted and sometimes wondering whether or not we can, I wake up the next day feeling empowered by what I know and what I have experienced, and reminding myself to never forget that. I'm empowered by the kind of organization such as yours, where you continue in this struggle with such a strong history and such a strong background. You have never given up. I will never give up. And I believe that despite we have not always reached those goals that we have set out for ourselves, we must always try. It is our sacrifice, if you want to describe it that way, to be on the cutting edge of these issues and to be willing to not only be on the cutting edge, but to say to our friends as well as those who are not our friends, Let's step up to the plate for real. No penny ante stuff is going to get this done. It is time for significant resources to be invested in housing for the people of this country. This is the greatest nation in the world. And being the greatest nation in the world, we can only maintain this reputation if we are fighting for all of the people, all of the time, with all of the resources we can bring to bear. And so I'm optimistic always.
Well, thank you. Our last question is, ending homelessness has been a priority for 40 years, and yet the numbers keep getting worse, even reversing modest gains 5 years ago. As a resident of Los Angeles, you know this better than anyone. What needs to be done to reverse this trend and ultimately eliminate homelessness?
Well, first of all, homelessness is exacerbated by other things that happen. For example, those people who have lost their homes or have not been able to maintain their rental housing, many of them unable to fill out forms that I'm fighting about that are unnecessarily complicated for many. Some of them now are looking for assistance because they're homeless. They have been driven into homelessness through no fault of their own, but because of this pandemic. And so we must also recognize always that the more we fight, sometimes circumstances causes an increase in homelessness that we had not anticipated. And so knowing that, I think that we have to take a look not only at the amount of resources that the federal government is making available, we must take a look at the way those resources are utilized and the way that they're used. I think it's time to, take a real close look at how we're doing it and see if we can do it better. One of the things we have recognized, and I alluded to in what I said a moment ago, for those developers who are willing to build low-income housing, we've got to help clear the path for them to be able to do so. Some of our cities, without trying to do it, have set up obstacles and difficulties for them, which increases the cost of building that housing. I'm told with some of the money that was raised in the Los Angeles area through ballot initiatives, the cost of trying to build low-income housing has risen to $500,000 a unit. This does not make good sense, and we've got to do everything that we can to make it cost-effective for developers to be able to do it. The other thing I've been looking at is trying to understand what other kinds of ideas and thoughts are emerging in other areas. Now, when I talked to LA County, for example, and I was very, very concerned about the fact that these makeshift camps were just exploding everywhere. And they're in the median down some of our major streets, and the trash and the debris that goes along with that. And I asked LA County, what are you doing about this issue? And they said, well, we don't do that. We give our money to LAHSA, and LAHSA is responsible for that. Well, what I'm seeing is that if you are capable and able to contact the resources that are available. For example, if you're temporarily out of work, you're educated, you've had, a home, etc., and you know how to try to get into the system to get help, you can get help. And LAHSA does a good job with that. But if you are under these highways and bridges in camps, nobody's coming to get you. Nobody's coming to ensure that you have not only a safe place to live, but even temporary shelter. And so when I talked to some of the other entities across the country, I found one city that had allocated a separate sum of money just to deal with the street encampments, because the money that we are providing simply does not stretch far enough, I believe, in order to deal with that kind of need that's out there. So now I'm looking at and have just started to look at in addition to what we traditionally do, and learning how we can do it even better, perhaps by erasing some of the obstacles that are created by the city. I'm looking at talking about an additional allocation that's targeted directly to the street, where you deal with removing those encampments and placing those people in safety and affordable places to live. And so I don't know where this is going to go, but we have to keep thinking creatively in order to deal with this issue. And so I appreciate everything that you do. I appreciate your advice and any thoughts that you may have, but we've got to be focused on ending homelessness despite what we're confronted with and the growth and the numbers that we're seeing, particularly in places like Los Angeles.
Well, thank you. You know, I always like to say that if you don't want affordable housing in your backyard, you're going to end up with homelessness in your front yard.
That's right.
So and I also want to recognize Lee Ragas from the Skid Row Housing Trust, who's the latest member of our National Advisory Council, and Ted Chandler from the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust, and Linda Manalini from Eden Housing, both Californians who are our immediate past chair and our second immediate past chair. So thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's been an honor.
Well, thank you all so very, very much. We're in a struggle, and I'm confident that we have what it takes. Let's get it done. Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I am going to go to the next item on our agenda, and that's the let's see here. The President's report, which I will now share my screen with you all. And go to home. Go to slideshow. Beginning. Okay. Can people see the screen? Somebody give me.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So the first thing on the agenda is NHC's membership history. And as you know, we struggled with our membership for many years. It has been on a steady incline. And at the end of last year, we had over 300 members. And year to date, we're actually up to 369 members. And I'm particularly proud that a significant amount of that membership growth has come from people in our leaders, emerging leaders in affordable housing program, which really are the housing decision makers of the future, and we are thrilled to have you all be a part of NHC. Our membership is incredibly diverse, and we have a representation from nearly every sector of the economy, and what I'm most proud of is that no more than 20% of our members are actually from any single sector of the housing industry. I'd also like to note that during COVID-19, we've been very active in a variety of ways. We've hosted a bi-weekly COVID-19 housing industry coordinating call with the leaders of all the major housing organizations that represent either industry sectors or other groups of organizations. And usually we go around the Zoom room for an hour and everybody shares what they're working on and how we can work together. Occasionally we have guests from outside. We've had Gene Sperling on our last meeting, who's the senior advisor to the president and working on the American Rescue Plan, getting that money out. HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge joined us right after her being named secretary designate, and Mark Calabria, the head of the FHFA, which supervises Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We also led a broad coalition to get $10 billion in direct assistance for homeowners hurt by the pandemic, included in the FY 2021 budget reconciliation bill that was signed by President Biden. Our advocacy on that was launched on January 21st. negotiated common principles for rental assistance early in the pandemic, which contributed to successfully passing over $45 billion in emergency rental assistance. The next thing I want to talk to you about is our financials. Our financial condition is very strong this year. We have been on a continued improvement with a lot of support from our board, particularly our chairs, Ted Chandler and Linda Mandolini, and Anne, who have really helped us rebuild our finances and our strength. Our cash on hand position this year at the end of 2020 was over $650,000. That was up $100,000 from the year before. And this year we were able to cut our budget and our expenses so that the money we lost from not having a gala was more than made up by creatively addressing our budget issues. I'd also like to note our COVID-19 Housing Resource Center really has been an incredible success. We got it up and running within weeks of the pandemic shutdown. Started with 200 resources. We now have over 2,300 that are updated weekly. We have had 250,000 page views on this site and 117,000 unique visitors. We have 10,000 who regularly return, and a significant number of the unique visitors have been consumers desperately looking for help to pay their mortgage or their rent. And so we have built out a consumer-oriented site that helps direct people to applications to get help within 3 clicks. We've also had a very strong year in terms of our outside communications. I'll just note for me, the most important one is our NHC member brief. And we hope that you're getting that you're enjoying it. If you have suggestions, don't hesitate to let us know. This really is your publication. We want to make sure that it serves you well. And our 2021 policy agenda. We have identified these critical areas that we're going to focus on: community development, climate impact, CRA modernization, emergency pandemic renter and homeowner assistance, health and housing, homelessness, housing finance reform, production and preservation of affordable housing, and racial equity, and closing the homeownership gap. These 2 areas, these many areas are incredibly important to all of our members, and our prioritization of them will really be managed as our opportunities rise and fall, but our staff is singularly focused on making a difference in each one of these. And then finally, I want to share with you a new video we produced to celebrate our 90th anniversary.
The National Housing Conference provides the best convening space I know, where those of us across the spectrum who care desperately about housing, but in different ways, can come together, find our common ground, and work to advance our shared mission.
I think when we talk about affordable housing, there's always a full circle. There's always a need for affordable housing.
It's not going to be done without organizations like NHC, who has the experience, who has the leadership, who has the track record of being committed to our communities.
Since October of 1929, people were losing their savings and their homes at a breathtaking rate. And our founder, Mary Kingsbury Simkovich, realized we would be much more effective if we partnered with those who would build the housing, like home builders and labor unions. She formed what I like to call an unlikely coalition around the slogan that jobs are housing and housing is jobs. Having Eleanor Roosevelt as one of her closest friends was a big part of early success. In 1933, she got us in front of President Franklin Roosevelt, and we were able to convince him that the first infrastructure bill of the New Deal should include money for the construction of affordable housing. Throughout our history, NHC has had a special relationship with many of the presidents who were most impactful on housing issues. We worked very closely with President Harry Truman on the 1949 Housing Act, which promised a decent home in a suitable living environment for every American family. That remains our vision today and remains unrealized.
Shockingly, it feels like we're there in so many ways today.
Today, we're facing the same issue. We have a tremendous shortage of decent, affordable housing.
There's people out there that are struggling, people out there that need that hand up, and there's nobody better than NHC when it comes to the affordable housing advocacy to make sure that our country is serving all of its citizens.
The pandemic has created enormous challenges, but also great opportunities for NHC to work with our members and take advantage of our unique role as the unlikely coalition that brings people together to find solutions to our most challenging problems.
We execute that through policy and through research and communication tools like our symposiums.
We created the COVID-19 Housing Resource Center, which now hosts over 1,800 individual sources of information drawn from hundreds of websites all over the country.
There's just a real energy and a lot of ideas being brought to bear around this concept of shelter and of home.
We reach both national and local organizations. So it's not just builders and developers and financial institutions, but we also have the minds of nonprofit agencies that are working in the communities.
No one organization can do it alone, but NHC has had the terrific track record of bringing people together to come up with creative solutions to make sure that all Americans are being served.
We've demonstrated the incredible power of collaboration, and that has served us well for 90 years. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat box or you can put it in the Q&A section. So a question from Linda Manalini, maybe you can talk about how people can become involved with our committees. Yes, we have a number of committees that work with us on a range of issues. I think the most important is our policy committee, and we are really looking at how we implement the policy that the board puts in place. That the chairwoman raised the issue, of course, of our advocacy, and I think that's something with our new policy team we're really looking at how to expand. It's probably a great time for me to introduce the new members of the policy team. Luke Villalobos, who is with us, thank you, in California. He's on his way to Washington this summer. And Luke, why don't you just give a brief introduction? He's the new Director of Policy and Research for us.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luke Villalobos. I'm the new Director of Policy and Research at NHC. Prior to that, I worked at an organization called Housing California in Sacramento, working on statewide policy for affordable housing and finance, land use and finance. And prior to that, worked in local government directly with developers and on the municipal side of development. Pleased to be a part of NHC and looking forward to working with you all.
Thanks, Luke. And Brittany Webb is also joined us, and Henry Weiss. And I want to thank them and just recognize their passion and time. And it's been a pleasure getting to know them and work with them. With that, I'll turn it back to Anne to close the meeting. And thank you all for being here.
Thank all of y'all for joining us. I genuinely hope this is our last completely Zoom membership meeting, because I am looking forward to being able to solve our technical problems just by looking each other in the eye. Even though I appreciate the fact that so many more of us can get together when it's by Zoom than we often can in person. And we're also beginning the planning for the gala, with a hope that we may be able to have an in-person event in the fall. So looking forward to seeing you. Thank you for participating with us today. We also look forward to our upcoming fall events, which we hope will be much more give and take and participatory. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anne.